There's no position in rugby union that inspires debate quite like the fly half jersey. But why is that? And what makes a test level fly half? To try and answer that question, I'm joined by professional analyst Angus Usher. Angus, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me on. It's really exciting to be here. I really love your work, and everything I've seen that you've done is all my cup of tea for sure.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. I hope we're going to have a really nerdy conversation today. So let's get straight into it then. So first of all, the fly half position. Why does that generate so much debate? Why is that the one that people get the most heated about online? Why is it the one that generates the strongest views, do you think, in the world of rugby union?
I think it's often down to kind of the cult hero status that a lot of these tens carry. They are obviously the generals. They control a lot of things themselves. Um, they are rugby's answer to the quarterback role, essentially.
Yeah.
And And if not given the same sort of a responsibility that the quarterback has, they still play such an integral role that being the face of a team is often the norm. And then you get these kind of massive followings that fall behind them. Someone like Marcus Smith is a great example that he will have a massive following regardless of whether they are English fans or Harlequin fans. He might just have people who are just fans. And I think Finn Russell's another good example of that. Manie Libbok has a huge following in South Africa, and and they are those kind of mercurial players often that just define games, bring out so much excitement. I mean, look no further than someone like Dan Carter, who I mean is still to this day considered one of the greatest to ever play the game. So they are often those players that people latch on to more than others.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, you've listed some great ones there. Manie Libbok, I count myself as a massive Manie Libbok fan. I think for me, uh, obviously the fly half after the scrum half is the one who perhaps touches the ball the most. And when it's someone like Manie Libbok doing his outside of the boot kicks and things, he's the player that makes you feel something the most as well. So I guess that's why they stick in your mind. But in 2025, as we are now, what makes a test level 10? So we're going into the Six Nations. All these 10s have been playing club level for how many months in the Northern Hemisphere? And now the debates are which of them should start for their country. And there will be fly halves that people will be massive fans of, who play great at club level but don't get the opportunities at test level. What, in your opinion, are the markers of a test level fly half?
It's it's definitely not black and white, but well, we all know that Test rugby and club rugby is just they are almost light years apart at certain levels. Obviously, there are the higher echelon of the game, like we're talking Leinster, Toulouse, that level where the line gets slightly more blurred, but not everyone is those teams, and the club level in general is always going to be a bit more free flowing. It offers a bit more in attack and less in defense in that way. And we do see test level rugby offering a different challenge for fly halves. In particular, those kind of key responsibilities that I would point out would be it's that marginal gain side of test rugby from one aspect. So very much the kind of Rassie mentality of Rassie Erasmus has always been a let's minimize how many mistakes we make, of course, because that is a big factor in rugby. You concede less tries, making less mistakes, etc. And if your 10 is a maverick in the way that they make a lot of mistakes, even if they are creating opportunities or the back out, that is not the general test quality of a fly half. Um, you want your fly half to be in a net positive in almost all moments, creating more than they are obviously causing.
Yeah.
uh, but then there are the obvious test aspects, the kicking, both for poles and your general kind of kicking game defensively, because in tight test matches, one missed tackle makes a much larger impact in a match than, say, a missed tackle in a club match. And the same goes for almost all actually moments in test rugby versus club rugby. That small instance where you've sliced a kick or missed a kick for poles or whatever it might be, those moments are at a higher kind of a level of importance at Test rugby, which is again probably why you do see slightly different fly halves in the Test sphere than you do in the club sphere in general. And you do have those players that never seem to transform into that Test player that you always thought they would, in both the fly half position and in many other positions. I often call it the kind of the my reference is probably a bit unfair on New Zealand, but I always call it the kind of New Zealand feel, which is a bit of a case of you see that player who is playing club rugby and doing all the offloading and all the exciting, flary, exciting stuff. And you've got to give him a test, a litmus test, essentially, to kind of really delve into the numbers and the eye test as well to see, is this person just flair or are they doing the grunt work that is required at test level? Because you need that. You absolutely need that. And you have that situation with players all the time. You have these players who shine at club level, doing all the exciting, flashy bits, but they never make it at test level because they're lacking some of those core foundations, in particular, safe hands, the safe net that the kind of coach wants, the player they can rely on in those really key moments.
Yeah. So something that you wrote about a while ago, and I'm going to bring some of it up on the screen as a bit of a window dressing for our YouTube viewers, is the defensive aspect of being a test fly half these days. And you wrote specifically about Sacha, Feinberg-Mngomezulu compared to some of the other Springbok 10s. I'm just going to play some video just to keep it interesting. You pointed out his big point of difference in terms of the number of tackles he makes and the percentage of tackles that he made as compared to the rest of his teammates. And I've started noticing, since I read your piece on it, I've started noticing which fly halves are the top tacklers for their teams. And Roman Ntamak is a great example. Is sometimes the top tackler for Toulouse. Sam Costello for the Scarlets is always our top tackler. And Caleb Muntz was a surprise one for me as well for Fiji. Is normally Fiji's top tackler. So it is the kind of the era of the 10 who can't tackle and who hides behind a flanker. Is that era gone?
I think as rugby evolves, those type of situations where we think of hiding a player in some way or another, whatever their skill set that needs to be hidden, that is slowly fading away in general. I think in 15 years' time, a player like, say, Willie Roux, for example, who obviously is such an incredible creator, such an incredible player in so many other ways, but defensively has always been a bit suspect. Someone like him may not exist in 15 years purely from a defensive perspective. I mean, as in he wouldn't be able to get away with being a defensive weakness in the rugby climate in 15 years' time, where every little bit of weakness that people can find are being exposed. And I think that's a big reason behind Rassi's decision for Sacha. He is an incredible defender. He is proactive in his defense. He seeks the tackle to a extent where I almost feel like he needs to be reined in slightly because he was
Well, he's
almost
injured a lot.
he's injured a lot and he is almost doing too much. But you can see in this chart here in particular the difference between his tackles versus Handre Pollard and Libbok, and that was a very small sample size, and actually the sample over time only kind of continued the same sort of trend. It slightly dropped. I believe he sat in the end around 10 tackles per 80, but still double that of Pollard and Libbok. And I think what Rassi would be kind of thinking in that sort of process would be, well, I can't rely on not only can I not rely on Handre Pollard and possibly Manie Libbok being around forever because of just age. Libbok is obviously a good 3 years younger than Pollard, but also if the future is going to be trying to lock up shop and make sure that you have no defensive frailties from an individual perspective, why not go for a player who obviously is incredibly talented, but also naturally already is a great defender?
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, there's definitely something since you wrote about it, it's definitely been on my mind a lot more. So what other stats do you look at specifically for a number 10 then? So obviously in rugby we get bombarded with lots of stats like meters made and things like that, line breaks and stuff. That's not necessarily what you're always looking for from your fly half. So when you're assessing a fly half and you're thinking, is this guy going to be test level or not? What stats do you go to first?
If I'm honest, I think data's weakest positions to measure are generally the fly half, scrum half, and wingers.
Oh,
Um,
really? Interesting.
just from if you had to pick a position that data tells the least amount compared to other positions, I would say those are the positions that it makes it a little bit harder to kind of receive. Um, but that isn't to say that there isn't plenty you can still get out of the data. There's just obviously more for other positions. Um, from a fly-off perspective, I would say there's different ways you look at it. Also very dependent on the style of play that you're playing. If you are a team that is very much wanting to control possession, then it would be more focused around the maintenance of that said possession. So passing accuracy and because then meters gained as your fly off is far less important when
Mm.
the main role they are is trying to pull players apart. Um, but there isn't a metric, at least not one that I've had access to, that is kind of a defining metric of control. And that's a difficult thing to define, but again, that's a seriously important part of a scrum half and fly half's role. And how do you measure that in a kind of very rational way? Because control doesn't mean slow ball to the breakdown. And if anything, it's better to have fast ball at the breakdown, quicker ball, scrum half getting the ball out quicker type of thing. So these kind of metrics in that way are very difficult to define a successful fly off. But what I would definitely start with is you look at defensive stats, because those are quite probably the one of the more universal metrics amongst positions. Obviously, props are lucky because props generally do the much closer pillar defending, which
Yeah.
generally means on average, your props are often your higher percentile tackle success ratios. I know Brock Harris, as a 40-year-old or almost 40-year-old, had, I believe, 100% tackle success when checked for over like quite a long period of
Yeah,
time.
but that's just because he's a legend.
So it is definitely obviously slightly positional dependent, but if you're comparing fly halves against fly halves, it's a very fair thing to kind of view. And then you start really picking up trends. I mean, you see something like Snell and Nohamba's defensive record being very poor. But you've also got to take the context of those type of things. You've got to see how players defend, because I've seen Handre Pollard make some serious howlers in defense, but he's a big lad. And then you've got smaller players who seem to make better tackles on the cover, but less front on tackles. And the best example of that comparison would be Libbok versus Pollard. I mean, who would you choose to play inside center out of Libbok or Pollard from a defensive perspective? You would choose Pollard every day of the week. But Libbok is a better covering tackler. He makes better recovery tackles. He
Turn
makes
and
better
burn.
tackles. Pardon?
Turn and burn.
Exactly. Turn and burn. He really has the legs for it. He's so quick. He's so agile. And the amount of covering tackles he makes is far greater. The quality of the tackles is far greater than his front on tackles, because front on tackles often with Libbok becomes it's it's it's
Speed bump.
it's exactly that. It's physics. He is 70 odd kgs against someone who generally, if they're running at that fly off channel, is probably 100 kgs. So the physics of it is often not in Libbok's favor. And we saw that in the World Cup where Bundyaki ran straight through him. And we've seen that many times before in the direct kind of contact situations. But when he's having to do covering tackles, it becomes a bit of a different dynamic, because he uses his speed, he uses his agility, and he uses his rugby brain, which he has a very good rugby brain for defensive moments too. I don't think people often realize that. Handre Pollard is almost the opposite. He's the player you want in those close contact moments, because he's quite physical, but sometimes when you see him out in the wider areas where he's having to turn quickly, and
The hips.
his hips don't seem to do the move so well, and we get those situations where he does sometimes look a bit like Bambi on ice, and that's why the debate around Pollard and Libbok, and I find it so interesting to me, because people online will say, oh, Pollard's so much better at defending, or Libbok so much better at defending. And I was like, well, they both actually not the best, but they have their strengths and they have their weaknesses. Then you get someone like Sacha, obviously, and that's where you kind of look at someone who goes, well, he can do both, and he's got the physical kind of presence to do the stop and go. He's got that front on tackle, and he's got a side on tackle, and covering tackles in his locker. So that's what's like really exciting to me about those type of young players coming through, is plugging those gaps. I find it really cool as an analyst and a Springbok fan to watch the Springboks and think, oh, well, that slight weakness we may have had at fly-half over the years, well, that could be plugged. That fullback weakness with Willie Leroux, well, Damien Williams is a brilliant defender, and he's been playing 15. Obviously, Apalele Fasi's defense has improved immeasurably as well. So these sort of gaps in our game that were not a tactical gap, nothing that the coaches essentially could do much about, but are now being solved just by young individuals coming through that are just better at those skills.
So that's defense then. Let's talk a bit more about attack. So I've spoken to a few people who have suggested that attacking rugby now is moving away from phase play and more towards starter play. So these kind of long sequences we've seen with Ireland is the ultimate example of just phase after phase after phase after phase of attack. It's now moving away from ruck heavy attacks and more into starter plays, into set plays, scoring quickly. Is that a trend that you've noticed as well?
Absolutely. And I think that's a lot down to how good the defense has been in rugby recently. I feel like I recently saw some stats on that. And if you're not scoring off that first set, the first phase, your odds of scoring diminish drastically over, I believe, in particular, the third, fourth, fifth phases, and then slightly kind of start rearing up again, and your chances improve over when you get to the latter phases of 10, 11, 12 phases. So coaches are trying to get that sweet spot, because obviously, again, risk and reward is the risk of holding on for 13 phases isn't always going to benefit you, while when that really high chance of getting points or gain line, etc., in the first phase, it's become a huge emphasis on attack coaches' mind. Something the Stormers in particular, while everyone else has moved in that direction, the Stormers have quite struggled with getting that go forward off that first phase, and almost relying on the magic over many phases, but they haven't, their first phase attack hasn't actually been as successful as they would have hoped with the attacking players they have.
Yeah, well, I could talk for hours about the troubles of the Stormers, but just to kind of back up what you're saying, I pulled up Opta Analyst club stats up here, and they've got a tab all about try scoring. And if you look at try origins, you talk about set piece, you can see there are teams, a lot of teams like above 70% in terms of try origins coming off set piece. And if you go on to first phase, again, a lot of tries where a good half are coming off first phase, and kind of supporting what you're saying. If you flip that the other way, the clubs who are scoring the least off first phase are the clubs like Newcastle Falcons and Zebra, who are arguably the weakest teams in their league. So that really speaks to the teams that are struggling to do this are generally the teams that are struggling to compete.
Absolutely. I feel if you, I mean, if you think about it in another context, if you looked at it as your opportunity is defined by those kind of probabilities. If you're not taking that initial probability and you're a weak team already, your chance now of getting a try is essentially waiting another 11 phases. If you were purely looking at from that kind of probability sector, your probability now is so low, especially as a weak team, you're not likely to score against a set defense in the third, fourth, fifth, sixth phase. You as a team generally won't have those game breakers that can just make something out of nothing. And therefore, the chance of you holding on to the ball for another 10 phases is just going to set you up for failure. So
Yeah.
it's a really troubling situation, because I feel like one of the least favorite things about this trend for me is the fact that it takes away a bit of the flow of rugby, because you've got set piece, first phase attack, try, back to kickoff. And for me, that kind of interrupts the flow a bit. But these are the trends of rugby. It's part of the cycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So how is this cycle then impacting fly halves then? Is the Maverick fly half less valued by an attack coach because it's so all about the set play? So it's all about executing your role in a organized, choreographed move, or like you alluded to then, having the game break as someone who can generate something out of several phases in. Like I think the example that you spoke about in one of your videos was Marcus Smith against the Springboks at Twickenham, about how he created that try. And exploited a couple of mistakes by the Springboks to a situation which looks like the best they were going to get out of it was a drop goal, and it's ended up in a try. So what's your kind of take on that? Is it kind of no, we'll always need a magician, or is it becoming less important?
I would say it really depends on the tactics of your team, but for the most part, yes, the value of the fly off I think has increased because of this. Um, and in particular, as you say, a maverick fly off, because if you can have someone, because your average maverick fly off is not going to not be able to follow instructions and do your first phase play that you may want to do. But if that should fail, they are the best placed 10 out of the options of 10s available. A maverick type 10 is the best place to then break down a defense in those less high probability phases that are coming up next. Um, that's where your Marcus Smith is so valuable. And I feel like we are going to see that. I think those Maverick 10s are still going to have the basic requirements, and those are never going to go. We're not going to have players just storm into the test scene, even if they cannot defend and cannot kick well and all of those type of things. Those factors are still important. Obviously, we have a strange situation in South African rugby when we have someone like Manie Libbok who is so different to the traditional South African identity, and at the same time, he's got obviously a mixed defensive record, as we've mentioned, and his goal kicking record is far from ideal. So he almost goes against that model, and I believe the hope from the Springbok coaching staff is that some of those things will come right. Obviously, the defensive aspect is set in stone. He's not going to suddenly be able to defend that kind of front-on tackle as well as say a 100 kg player. Obviously, that's just physics. But the kicking is something that is obviously worrying, because someone like him has dropped off over the years, and I've tracked his statistics on that over the years, and you can see the progressive decline, which is obviously really unfortunate for both the person and the clubs and nation that he plays for, because they all need that aspect to him. They don't have someone else who can really take the reins when he's starting.
I do find that weird about South Africa that there's no one else who can. I know that in one game, Jaden Hendricks was taking the kicks, but obviously, as a Wales fan, I've spent 10 years watching Lee Halfpenny kick from fullback and from the wing. We've got Ramos now playing for France doing the same thing. So it's odd that South Africa has this goal kicking kind of deficit. Like there's obviously guys like Colby who can kick a ball, but it's for such a rich rugby nation. It's odd to have that kind of gap.
Absolutely. We are I think we are behind in goal kicking for sure. Absolutely. I've looked at some of the juniors coming through. I've done a full review of kind of South African rugby players in general's kicking success rates compared to countries abroad, and I believe I've even posted some stats about that. And Ireland are kind of quite far ahead, as well as Wales, but South Africa are quite far behind. And yes, there is definitely an aspect of it's traditionalism in South Africa. It's the fly-half kicks. So when they're growing up in school, who's the fly-half? They kick. And South Africa is very kind of, I wouldn't say backwards, but the country as a whole still is very old-fashioned in its rugby sense.
We've got Cheslin Colby throwing into lineouts, so why can't we get our head around this?
But exactly, but at junior levels, I mean, I've been living in the UK for quite a while now, but it was a bit of a culture shock to me when I arrived from South Africa, to find out that schools weren't doing lineouts and they weren't doing scrums. And I was kind of like, well, in South Africa, we started lineouts and scrums at like 9 years old, 10 years old, or something along those lines. So for me, it was a huge like shock to know that the kids weren't doing scrums and lineouts and the set piece, and weren't kicking for poles and all those type of things that in South Africa you do from the beginning. I mean, essentially, 15-a-side men's rugby is basically you just dragged and dropped over putting, and you just get the 9-year-olds to do it type thing. And clearly, other countries have seen a weakness in that mentality. Clearly, they've seen that by removing the set pieces and the kicking, you can put more focus on ball in hand for players and other players getting more touches, etc. All of the kind of the obvious development processes for young players. But what South Africa has done, at least from what I can remember growing up, and I believe still to this day is still similar, it's still quite professional in that way. They still keep to as high professional rules as possible. They want to still have lineouts. They want to have scrums. They want to have a 9-year-old kicking for poles. And I believe that's to the detriment of a lot of these young players, because then they are defined as well. If you are a hooker at 9, you're a hooker forever. If you're a fly-half who's kicking for poles at 9, that's kind of your thing. And it probably means that more players are shoehorned into those roles earlier on than possibly other nations.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, sticking with goal kicking, then, this is something that I wanted to ask you about. So, goal kicking is the kind of it for all the stats and the complication in rugby. Goal kicking is a thing that the casual fan who's never watched a rugby game before can wrap their head around, because it's, there's that link to football, and anyone can see if a goal kicker, you can watch them take 5 kicks and figure out whether they're a particularly good one or not such a good one. But I feel like we're kind of in, the online culture is if they've missed 2 kicks in a game, they're rubbish. But even that, it might be they've missed 2 out of 6, which isn't actually that bad. So, what kind of percentage is decent for a goal kicker?
I believe that, as they say, the industry standard is 80% and above is what ideally your good quality goal kicking tens should be doing. If you want to be known as a good goal kicker at test level, 80% and above is what you'd be expecting, which is your Owen Farrell, Handre Pollard, Marcus Smith, I believe, to an extent,
Dan Bigger.
Dan Bigger, Sexton as well. I mean, it's kind of those players that you'd expect. Where it becomes a bit blurred is then obviously you have those players who take the longer shots at goal as well. So you're, again, Lee Halfpenny, Francois Steyn, those type of players who are also tasked with 55-meter, 60-meter kicks. And that makes kicking percentages a little bit more complex to use. And that's why you need more detail from a kind of an XG perspective, like expected goals in
Yeah.
football. You need to almost have a expected KG for your kind
Yeah,
of.
Opta have started doing that in the last couple of years, and I love it. It's one of my favorites rugby stats is Opta's expected points from kicking because exactly as you said, it's that taking that idea from football and it's directly, there's a model that's understood and it works. And I think again, coming back to Sacha, I think Opta posted that in the URC last season, he was the player who overperformed his XG the most.
Yeah.
And Jordan Hendricks is another player like also takes on the long kicks. I think one of my favorite things that someone ever showed me on Twitter was comparison between Lee Halfpenny and Dan Biggar, and Dan Biggar's percentage was higher, but Halfpenny took on harder kicks. So if you compare it from that point of view, Halfpenny was a better goal kicker, but they were both obviously world class. But kind of on that, the it depends on conversions versus penalties as well, doesn't it? Because a lot of conversions are kicked from the touchline, or a lot of tries are scored in the corner. So those conversions are harder. And someone made a great point to me, like an example is Cardiff. Is Callum Sheedy's goal kicking stats this season are not very good at all. But if you look at where Cardiff are scoring their tries, they score a lot of tries in the corner. So it's really hard for him.
Yeah.
But if you take a penalty kick, a kicker has a decision about whether they want to take that kick on or not. And most kickers will only take on ones that they feel 8 out of 10 that they're going to get. But the question that I was talking with mutual friend Harry Jones about was, is kicking, taking the three, going out of fashion in rugby at the moment?
It depends. It depends on which level of the game you're talking about. I feel like at a Rugby World Cup, if there was a Rugby World Cup tomorrow, we would see just as many penalties as ever. Um, because again, the marginal gains aspect of things, I still think teams would see 3 points as when defenses. I mean, we looked at the World Cup final, South Africa versus New Zealand. It's small margins. It's a single kick, a Geordie Barrett missed kick, if you want to look at it like that. Um, there are so many aspects from that perspective. In club rugby, in particular, that I can give a more defined answer. I wouldn't really ever take kicks at goal from a penalty. Um,
Really?
it, it's a very rare occurrence where it's depending on my goal kicker as well. But as a coach, if for example, Stormers is a good example, just kick everything for touch. Because Manie Libbok's not been kicking well, unless it's right in front of the post and it's a guaranteed three, you may as well just kick everything for touch. The only problem with that decision making with the Stormers in particular is the Stormers maul has not been working very well. So it's a bit of a catch-22 if your maul isn't working well. But if you have a decent to good maul, it also obviously very much impacts your decision. I guess you can look at the whole kind of spectrum of it. The quality of a kicker versus the quality of more, and you can find the sweet spot in between of where you'd get your benefits. It's the type of thing where expected points can be hugely beneficial as well, because you as a team could do your self-analysis, understand the chance of your points being scored off a certain part of the game against a certain opposition, off a certain position of the maul, for example, and then you could use that data to say, well, actually, we'd be better off relying on our 79% goal kicker from this position instead of going for touch. And that's like a good example of expected points being used in a kind of analysis context.
Yeah. So I get the stat that sticks with me is I think I worked out that last season in the URC, Glasgow in the regular season took 3 shots at goal in the whole season. And that speaks to the trend. So you'd
And who was the
really
top scorer in last year's URC season?
uh top point scorer. Do you know the answer? Is this a quiz?
Top try scorer,
Oh, top try scorer. Oh, it's Johnny Matthews,
who is
the
Glasgow hooker,
Glasgow
and
hooker. Yeah.
therefore everything was kicked for touch, and they mauled everything, and they scored a lot of maul tries. Um, I can totally believe that Glasgow only had 3 penalties, because you look at their maul tries and you just expect that. An interesting one from that is also the season before, Ulster had the most maul tries, and their goal kickers also had very high goal kicking percentages, which you would think really high amount of maul tries, also really high kicking percentage, fair play to the goal kickers, because they've kicked clearly very difficult kicks all the time.
Yeah.
So I think that's that's a very basic way without having the positional data of all the goal kicks to kind of go, well, that kick has done very well. When whatever half of his kicks have come from maul tries.
Yeah, and the Scarlets played the Ospreys earlier this season. We took a lot of kicks for goal, but our attacking maul has been quite good. And in the end, we lost the game by a point. And we were all sat like kind of doing the maths afterwards, just like, well, the kicker missed two kicks at goal. If what instead of going for goal, he'd gone for the touch and we'd have scored a try, even if it was unconverted, we'd have won the game. So it is kind of simple maths at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
It's an interesting one. I do love the conversation about um, going for poles or going for touch. I always I love it. And as I said, the spectrum is so dependent on the players you have available and your strength of kicker and maul, etc.
there's
But
some game state to it as well, isn't there, though? Sometimes just taking the three just is like just takes the edge off. Obviously, it introduces a break to the game and it just keeps the, as they say, keeps the scoreboard ticking over. I guess that's another kind of on the 10 to be the manager of the game, isn't it? Is if the 10 is the goal kicker and just say, look, yeah, we might go to the corner and we might score, but right now, let's just take the three, take a breather, get back on top.
absolutely. I mean, an underrated aspect to it as well is your restart receipt quality. Are you good at getting out of your own half after a restart? Because if you are shaky under the restart and you've just kicked a penalty hoping that 3 points is going to make a massive difference, and you have a terrible kind of record from getting out of your own half after a restart, well, now you put yourself under pressure and you could concede 7. So those type of decisions also need to kind of be taken into account. You've got to take a lot of different kind of steps into account before you decide, is this 3 points really worth it? Is this 3 points worth putting ourselves back under pressure again? It's fascinating. I mean, that's what makes sports so exciting.
That is a great debate, and I'm definitely going to expand on that more and probably make a specific video about that because it's something that's really caught my eye lately. So I'm really enthused by the chat we just had. But if other people are enthused by the chat we just had, please consider subscribing to the channel. If you are enjoying what you're seeing, share a link with a friend, maybe leave a comment with your thoughts down below. If you're listening on audio format as well, if you could give a 5-star review, it's really hard to grow audio podcasts. So 5-star reviews, sharing links with friends really, really helps. And like I said, if you're watching on YouTube, nearly 90% of the people who watch the videos on YouTube aren't subscribed. So if you could help that particular stat, that would really help out. So cheers in advance. Okay then, Gus. Let's talk about you. So you're a professional analyst. So I guess just kind of introduce to us your journey into analytics and how you apply that to how you make your living these days.
Um, it's quite a new thing for me, actually. I've always loved analysis, and I've been doing it from a young age. But the actual professional element to it was something I wasn't sure I would be doing 5, 6 years ago. Um, I initially moved over to the UK at the beginning of 2019 after finishing my bachelor's degree, and a non-sporting bachelor's degree, because in South Africa there weren't really sports-related qualifications in the way that I wanted to do it. And I moved to a school essentially to coach sport. I thought that's the best way for me to get into sport is to coach it. And I coached rugby at a school in Oxfordshire, and I took kind of a few different other sports teams as well, football and cricket, etc. And after a few years there of doing that and developing my kind of general career, I decided to do my master's in sports analysis, which a master's in sports performance analysis was something I never thought existed 10 years ago. So it was amazing for me as someone who was so interested in the analytical side of sports. And while doing my master's, part of that was working. Well, you had to work at a professional sports team at the same time. So to combine the kind of practical and the kind of education at the same time. And I worked at Ealing Trail Finders at that time, which
Oh,
was an
cool.
amazing experience because
Yeah.
Not only a club that clearly has high ambitions, but also had a very well settled, well structured analysis department. Um, for context, it's a championship rugby team in England, and they have, well, they had at the time five analysts working for them,
Wow.
um, including a analyst, and not including some academy intern analysts even. Um, and they had a recruitment analyst. So the team was big. If you included a recruitment analyst and the academy interns, it was probably 7, 8 people. Um, and you compare that to, say, a South African team, I believe the Blue Bulls have one analyst. Um, the Sharks have two. Stormers have one. Lions have one, I believe. So you compare that to a South African context, and the resourcing available for a team like Ealing Trailfinders to have so many analysts. Um, it was a great environment for me to learn in.
Yeah.
Whereas at the same time, I was obviously doing an actual master's in the field. Um, and after my kind of time there was up, as well as my master's finished, I just went into the job hunting scene. I spent some time working for Oval Insights, doing some kind of Q&A of their work and making sure that kind of data was accurate.
Hmm.
And did a little bit of work with the Sharks at the time then as well, doing some opposition analysis. Again, all just kind of pro bono, free stuff. And then I finally got a chance to work at a kind of football club, because I've always been big into football, and I love the tactical side of football that is so available. You can open any kind of sports website and get a tactical read up of a football team, and details and videos and all sorts. And I always was fascinated by football tactics. So they saw some of my football tactics work that I'd posted many years ago, and some of the kind of analysis I'd done on football. And the football team I now work for in the Premier League was excited to have me on, and since have been working there now for over 2 years. And as much as I try my best to keep my hand in rugby and keep my foot in the door, which is why I spend so much time on Twitter and YouTube and Substack, etc., trying to do some sort of rugby analysis. Um, I've of course got a massive commitment to now the footballing world.
Yeah. So this is a topic that I'm really passionate about, is exactly as you said just then. You can access so much data-driven content as a football fan compared to rugby. There are whole YouTube channels that aren't just like you or me voicing over a screen grab or something. It's like studio shot, professionally backed, you know, analysis content, heat maps, and all these kind of things. So, what kind of things do you think that rugby can learn from how football does stats? Because I always find it ironic that rugby fans in the UK tend to look down on football fans like, oh, they're the simple people. We're the sophisticated rugby fans. But the truth is that football fans are very highly educated about their sport these days, and stats are a huge part of that.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the availability of all of that, it is incredible. You can get access to the most unbelievable statistics for free in football. You can go onto FBref and a lot of these websites and get incredible granular data, to the nth degree. I mean, there's so much available, and it means interested fans, passionate fans who just want to put things together can open up a visualization tool like Tableau and import all this free data, visualize things, post videos about it, post clips about it. Basically what I try and do on Twitter, but with far more data available to them. And it's the same for you, I'm sure. I mean, I know you use Opta Analyst data that you said mentioned there, and you grab any data that is available in rugby, but it's still so surface level. And what we get offered in rugby is it's just nothing compared to what's given out in football for free again. Um, and to get access to that sort of level of data in rugby would require thousands of pounds, and it's just
Yeah.
not feasible for the average fan, content creator, even more serious rugby coaches, etc. Sometimes can't afford to pay thousands of pounds for data that they just can't essentially can't justify.
Yeah, so I'll just bring up an example. So I get asked all the time whenever I do a stats drop, Hugh, where do you get these stats from? And my main resource is Rugby Pass, uh, match center. So you click on a fixture and it has a stats tab. Now, it's far from perfect, and you will see sometimes obvious mistakes on this website, but it's free to access and it's got loads of game stats and it's got individual player stats, which are very rare in other places. That's freely available anyway. But these are the kind of things that a rugby fan gets. So personally, I really like the territory and possession maps and things like that. Um, but it's like you said, it's quite service level. So, when you as a rugby fan are watching TV and things, and they're incorporating stats into the broadcast, which ones do you think, yeah, that's good, and which ones are you like, that's not really helping the viewer here?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure I have a distinct answer. I mean, I'm sure there are many that's frustrated me. I think broadcasting in rugby is definitely quite far behind. Uh, Possibly examples, maybe specifically around players. Often you'll see a player graphic come up at halftime or something, and it'll show a fly half, and then it'll say how many rucks they've hit, something silly. And I've seen that before and thought, what on earth why are you telling me how many rucks the fly half has hit? Um, so there are those sort of cases, but I mean, it brings me back to almost a bugbear of mine in general is data is only worth anything if it's used in the right context. Um, I feel like so often people use it in the wrong context, and also so often people place too much emphasis on certain things. Um, I guess I get exposed to that all the time through
Hmm.
the way people argue on Twitter, as well as what I see in my office, as well as what I see in
Tackle success is the one for me. That when someone starts talking about tackle success of like a winger or something, I'm like, well, okay, we're not having a sensible conversation here.
there's so much context you've got to take into account with those type of things. I feel like one of my worst is when people refer to, say, tries is one, actually, ironically. I know tries is such a common one for everyone to use, but I feel like there's so much. A good example is people use Ches and Colby's lack of tries, or his lack of try ratio as a stick to beat him with. And I kind of say to people quite often, if you've watched Cheslin play, you'll have seen that there's basically never been a chance that he's not taken. If anything, he takes those. I mean, the World Cup final 2019, British and Irish Lions tour. How many times can we say he's made a try out of nothing?
Yeah, he takes chances that weren't there.
Exactly. And how many times has he not scored like a try that he should score? It never happens. He scores everything he's given, and then he scores tries that he makes himself. So it's such an absurd way to kind of to belittle a player and say, oh, but he has the fewer tries or something. Very often it's down to the wing that they're playing on. Very often it's down to the style of play. Very often there's so many factors. I mean,
Mm.
um, you could compare a whole bunch of players and their try ratios, and I promise you, if you order it by descending and end up picking the top 20 players of try ratios of players, say who played over 50 matches or whatever it might be, the players with ratios of 1.5 or 2 or whatever at the top aren't all going to be your best wingers or your best try scorers. They're just going to be players who were sometimes in the right place at the right time, which is a skill in its own right. That is fair. But also, sometimes rugby is just fortuitous. You just sometimes I mean, I can't count the amount of times that Makazola Mapimpi has been able to just catch the ball and score. Um, half his try record, I mean, half his try catalog is him catching the ball, taking a few steps and scoring. And often that's been because of work that's been done beforehand, and then the ball
And he's
gets
playing
out.
on the left wing.
He plays on the left wing, right-hand dominant rugby teams, as well as also situations like it's sometimes down to a player as well just being in the right moment, not just because positioning is a huge factor, but sometimes it's just a fortuitous bounce of the ball. Sometimes you get those bounces where it bounces away from you, it bounces towards you. There's nothing you can do about that. That is quite literally luck of the draw. And I feel like because of that, it's been a bugbear of mine for so long that people put so much emphasis on the try ratios or all of that. I mean, it's important, but it's really, really not the be all and end all.
Yeah. I'm glad I got one. I'm glad I got one. I got a rant out of you. That's what I was hoping to do. So yeah, so let's now talk about an exciting tie-up for you because you're a Sharks fan, aren't you?
I am.
That's right.
I'm from Durban originally.
So you did a takeover of the Sharks socials in the run up to the Toulouse game, a huge occasion, the most anticipated Champions Cup game of the season so far, in my opinion. And you took it over, and you did a few stats on Toulouse. So, going through a few of these, I guess first question. What did you learn about Toulouse doing this stats deep dive? What was the thing that you were like, 'cause obviously, as we stand today, best club team in the world. What was the thing that made you go, oh, okay, these guys are something different, if there was anything?
I mean, I must be completely transparent. I didn't do a deep dive at all. It was a very shallow dive, if I'm honest. I had quite limited data to work with because of the time frame that we discussed this whole element with the Sharks. So I am actually going to do more of this with the Sharks, and we're hoping to do more of this in the future. And they want to give me access to far more data than I had in the build up to the Toulouse game, because in that case I had essentially what you see in those clips is basically all I had. There wasn't anything more. And it was very, very shallow. So what I did pick up from the shallow data I had was how incredible they were in defense, and not in the traditional defensive element of, wow, they are beating everyone at the gain line defensively and making high tackle success and all of those type of ones that people would generally think, oh, well, that means they're defending well. But their breakdown work was just unbelievable. The amount of turnovers that they had players making, the presence of say, yeah, Jack Willis in particular, incredible. I mean, he himself had 54%, I believe, of all of the jackal penalties, um, which was which was an absurd number. And then, as I say there, 38% of total turnovers, whether it be a jackal penalty or a turnover one. So it's an unbelievable amount from one individual. In particular, someone who is also so versatile. He's not your stereotypical I can only fetch type player. He's like you would say maybe a Marco van Staden would be. Like a Marco van Staden is very much, he's there to steal the ball. Um, Jack Willis offers so much more. But then it was not just that, but then you could see from their turnover stats, you could actually see, if you go back up, their attacking element to that. So the amount of offloads, clean breaks, support breaks, defenders beaten, you could see a lot of their attack then was in those moments. They were both transitioning incredibly quickly after a turnover, quick attack, often scoring tries off those turnovers. Um, but when they weren't doing that, they were also the team that was dominating the most possession. So it's this horrible combination of a team that is dominating possession, dominating you physically. And when you do get the ball, you're also at serious risk of being turned over, where they will then counter and score a try. And if that sounds very familiar, it's a terrifying aspect for I think most teams when you think about a team that can do that to you, because it's it's exactly what I think an attack coach's nightmare. It's a defense coach's nightmare. And what we're seeing from them at the moment, what they did to Leicester Tigers was just astonishing.
It was yeah, amazing. What is a supported break? Because I saw that in the stats and I don't know what that is.
It's essentially just if there is a player in an offloading space on the shoulder of an attacking run. So if a player's made a break and he has an option to pass to a said player, that is a supported break.
Hmm.
Uh, and it's quite a new stat, and I think it's a really great one because it helps you build that picture of when that player makes a mistake, which we have so often when you have a player make a break and not pass or end up going straight into contact, whatever it might be. It gives you an idea of you can start looking at was that supported or was the decision made because there was no support. Those supported breaks, teams with higher supported breaks are also making more offloads, which are also making more gain line. So you're starting to see that kind of those trends with this new statistic that I'm so glad they brought out. I mean, it is so exciting to see rugby bringing out more and more stats that give us just a clearer picture of what's going on in a rugby match.
Is that a bit subjective though? Sometimes I look at rugby stats and I think so someone goes through and codes. I don't know if you've ever done stats coding, but I've never have. So that made it sound like I've done it. I haven't.
Very tedious.
There, there must be sometimes you have to make a call and you have to go, has that defender really been beaten, or was they never in a really, position to tackle, or was that an offload or a pass, or things like that? Does that that must drive stats coders nutty sometimes, having to do that kind of subjective thing in a for data that's going to be tried to be used completely objectively.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's the exact reason. I think you and I have even discussed this online before, is the exact reason why so many data providers have different stats for.
Opta and Oval agree on nothing. I think they have
Yeah.
different definitions of a meter.
Um, and it is very frustrating. Of course, it's very frustrating, but what you can generally get out of all the sites is they all have a similar trend. There are exceptions to that. There are some times where the stats are so far apart that you think there's almost must be a bigger issue. But for the most part, you can still paint the picture. And that's really what data is all about. It's 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 a subjective sport. It is. I mean, being a referee in rugby is half your role is being an interpreter because you're not just making decisions on fact. There's also so much interpretation. And I think when you start looking at stats in rugby from that perspective, that if the referee is having to do everything from that perspective, then you can be a bit more lenient with your stats as well. You can be like, well, maybe that was a support break, but they've not coded it that way. It's fine. It'll be made up in the long run of all the stats. That's the way I like to at least think about it. So my kind of OCD mind won't keep me up at night about some stats that are coded badly. But in particular, I think it's the general trend. You aren't going to break the game by defining by saying to your team or using the stat for a greater model of some sort, saying there were 9 supported breaks when there were actually 10, or there were
Yeah.
whatever it might be. It shouldn't break the game really.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So, before we move on to the next topic, just letting people know that if you would like to support the channel a bit more than just subscribing, then there is membership available. If you decide to go for membership, it costs 99 pence per month, which is the lowest YouTube lets you set it at. And if you go for that, you'll get access to exclusive videos that aren't available to anybody else. They're all in a special membership playlist. And like I said, 99 pence a month, and that just helps cover the costs of making a YouTube channel, which currently costs money. And if you'd like to help cover those costs, then that would be massively appreciated. Okay, then, Angus. This is coming out mere days before the Six Nations kicks off, the most exciting time of year in Northern Hemisphere rugby. Um, what are the kind of narratives that you are looking forward to seeing play out over the next 7 weeks?
It's going to be an interesting one. I feel like there's a expectation on France, both from themselves and I guess the rest of the world, after quite a poor showing last time, as well as the success of Toulouse, which are so kind of intertwined with the French national team as well. So there's going to be a huge expectation on them, and I'm really intrigued to see how that plays out. There's obviously the Lions Tour aspect, which is so interesting because it's going to be a whole bunch of debate around players who should be playing, and it's going to be constantly every weekend's going to be, oh, who's now in line for the 12 jersey, who's in line for the 10 jersey. It's going to be very funny for that from that perspective. I think we have a lot of debate online, which will be quite exciting. And a big one, I think, which I haven't seen much talk about, but is going to be the absence of Farrell, of course, because now that he's not in charge of Ireland, I wonder if there's going to be any talk about what's going to be happening over this kind of Six Nations from that perspective, because he's obviously focusing on the Lions tour. He's preparing for that. It almost becomes a bit of a scapegoat. You could say, oh, well, we did badly because Farrell wasn't there. But I think I don't think the Irish will accept that. Um, but that's an interesting aspect for me because I've always been such a firm believer. No offense to Farrell or anyone in the Irish system, but I think the Irish system is so strong. That's what makes the Irish team so strong. Is their system and their structures are built from the ground up, and the way everything goes through the process is all so great that the head coach is obviously an important role, but it's not nearly as kind of defining as say Rassie Erasmus at the Springboks or someone like that, because their process, their structure is so well oiled that it'll be interesting to see if it can just smoothly go with their new coach. It's Simon, isn't it?
Simon Easterby,
Used to be
Scarlet Legend.
Scouse. Um, so yeah, that'll be interesting. It's how that kind of change is really both processed by the media and possibly whatever might happen off the back of, say, a negative result or something like that, as well as just in general, if there's much difference to Ireland, which I doubt there will be.
It's such a great point, and you're right. I've not heard someone mention it. I was thinking, I do expect Ireland to dip this Six Nations. Now, dipping from very high is still high, but I do expect it, and I do think that Farrell will have a factor on that. I think Ireland are going through a bit of a transition, and it's kind of they're dropping it from the 110% to just like the 90% for me. And the stats of no one has ever won three Six Nations in a row. That has weights. The format of the Six Nations lends itself to different winners, whereas the Rugby Championship being played, home, well, not home and away anymore, but double headers against everyone makes it less likely for a freak result. You can get unusual results in the Six Nations. And last year, no one had ever won back-to-back Grand Slams. Ireland failed to achieve that. Now, no one's ever won three Six Nations in a row. I expect Ireland not to achieve that. And I agree with you. There's huge pressure on France. There's huge pressure on France because that generation of talents that they've got can't the some reward for that can't be one Grand Slam in 2022 and then in 2025 they still haven't won anything else since. That's just not a fair reflection of that team. But Scotland is the other one. We've since learned in the last few days that Sione Tuipulotu is out. That's going to be a huge blow to them. But uh, every year this could be Scotland's year, and it just never is.
I know it's a sad one because I mean, with a name like Angus Usher and my family history and background, I mean, I've got a lot of connections to Scotland, but um, yeah, it's quite unfortunate because they are all seemingly always in touching distance. I feel like um, the forwards pack probably can't well, I don't think it really can compete with your France and Ireland. The backline can, of course, they've got an incredible backline in that way. But I don't think from a forwards perspective they are able to compete over a kind of Six Nations to be genuine contenders for winning it. I would love to see be proven wrong. It'd be amazing to see something different in the Six Nations. But you know, the story is quite kind of familiar for us now. It's Scotland having one of those games where they end up losing by a try to Ireland, and then there's another slip somewhere else, and that's about it.
Yeah. How is the Six Nations perceived down in the Southern Hemisphere? Because I've heard some South Africans talk about it. But not, I'm not disparaging South Africans. I listen to a lot of South African rugby content. That's why I've heard them talk about it. Is that you know the All Blacks and the Springboks play in the Rugby Championship, and they are objectively, historically, the two best teams in the world. So therefore, the quality of rugby in the Rugby Championship is higher than that in the Six Nations. But there's this, from my biased point of view, being a Northern Hemisphere fan, there seems to be a magic about the Six Nations that the Rugby Championship doesn't seem to have. What's kind of the view, the Southern Hemisphere view on the Six Nations?
It's a much better packaged product for starters. Purely from if you were removing all the emotion, all the rugby almost, um, it's just a better product. It's packaged better by broadcasters. The kind of hype about it is better. I mean, goodness, if you've seen the Twitter account that runs the rugby championships,
I watched Ella Ferguson's TikTok
yeah,
about it.
it's just a disaster. So from that aspect alone, there's just no competition. It makes it incredibly difficult to start making arguments about, oh, how great the rugby championship is from that perspective. Obviously, the rugby championship does have South Africa versus New Zealand head-to-heads. It's got South Africa versus Australia. It's got Australia versus New Zealand. Argentina have been playing great rugby now, so they are starting to kind of come into those conversations about being like big head-to-heads. But unfortunately, there's a detracting factor in the way that Australia never beat New Zealand anymore. So
Yeah.
that's almost a write-off every single time. It's unfortunate. It's made the competition far less successful. I mean, not less successful, less interesting, because I mean, you can almost guarantee New Zealand are going to beat Australia every time. If you went back to the early 2000s, that was a completely different story. It was very much 50-50. Nowadays,
Australia reigning Tri-Nations champions to this day.
yes, true. This is very true. I think Australia might have one win in the last like 20 against New Zealand or something ridiculous. I don't know the stats. You can't quote me on that one, but it's a walkover every time it seems. And then Argentina, Australia can be quite fun, but there's not much hype to it. And then you get New Zealand, South Africa, and of course that's a huge game, and those are always like titan clashes. Like it's always something stupidly exciting happens, or there's the Ellis Park one that Jones refereed and all of that. Like there's so many incredible moments, but I think it's unfair to just say that the Rugby Championship's better than the Six Nations off the basis of two fixtures and a handful of obviously quality teams as well. I mean, you've got Argentina playing great rugby and Australia are improving, but it's hard to describe why that's not at the same level as Six Nations. And the Six Nations is more about, to be honest, obviously there's that aspect of it's the median. You've got the quality of teams are more pushed together. There's
Yeah.
less spread. It's less predictable. You don't have a team like New Zealand beating a team like Australia 20 times almost in a row, which is just absurd. I mean, the only time you see that maybe is if it's someone's record against Italy, and then even Italy have improved massively in
I
recent
think
years.
England are the only ones to yet to fail to beat Italy.
They always seem to be absolutely fine against Italy.
There's
It's
always a funny refereeing decision in those games. Moving
weird
on.
for me. Like England, I mean, I've never been an English fan for rugby. Like if I want anyone to lose, it's going to be England. And right answer on a Welsh podcast. But for some reason, it's when England play Japan and when England play Italy, I just I have absolutely no hope. I know they're going to win it by 20, 30 points. Like, how often do England play Japan? They play them like twice a year and they beat them by about 40 points.
Yeah,
I don't understand who sets up those fixtures, but someone's getting an absolute bargain out of that because they know they can guarantee an England win by about 40 points.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So let's finish up then on a tactic or a trend that people should keep an eye out for when watching this Six Nations.
It's gonna be the box kick, isn't it? It's this new law that was introduced a few months back now, whatever, 4 or 5 months ago, um, maybe not even that long ago, and it's all about that kind of glove. I mean, every rugby coach has the different terminology for it. We used to call it glove. It's really quite interchangeable, but if you can escort now that you can no longer escort or glove your kicker, that's just changed. It's just changed the game. It's going to negatively impact, I think, smaller wingers. I think
Yeah.
wingers
I,
with a
I
less
asked I asked someone this the other day, is that are South Africa going to have to pick taller wingers now? And that was a trend of it. And Wales have just called up Ellis Mee, who's 6'4". He's only been playing club rugby for a few months, but he's 6'4". And so as soon as I saw him play, I was like, well, he's going to get called up because exactly this. It's these escort lines, tall wingers. We saw what Freddie Stewart did against Aronson in that test.
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be very interesting. I think if this law was brought out before Cheslin Colby and Aronson were kind of playing for the Springboks, it might have almost curtained their chances of playing for the Springboks. Now that they are so established and so well, kind of, I mean, we know exactly what we're getting out of them. Because they were a risk. Originally, they were a risk. Russie was hesitant about Colby for a while, um, and Jacques Nienaber was obviously just completely taken back by Arendse after 2 matches. He said after 2 matches, like, "Wow, this guy's going to play so many games for the Springboks." But it was only because of their performances. Like when they actually stepped onto the pitch, they realized this guy's almost a different animal in a test scene, and I think because they already settled, I don't think we have to worry about them maybe getting phased out too quickly or too easily. But it's going to be a challenge for them. They've now got unrestricted access to their airspace. The opposition has unrestricted access to their airspace. I mean, you can imagine how difficult it is for someone like Cheslin Colby to compete against a Freddie Stewart when essentially he's starting with a 50, 60 centimeter head start.
You know, when you
Uh,
put arm span into that.
and then you have arm span, and often, not always, the defending player has the same sort of maneuverability in that kick as well, because they might have to backtrack, which means you're jumping backwards, which is a terrible thing to do in rugby. If you do get enough time to track back and then get a bit of a run up, you're not going to have as much of a run up as the player who's had that full sprint of a run up, essentially. Um, it's it's a really difficult one to kind of decide now. Is what do you as a coach do? I personally would start looking towards moving, like having essentially playing a model that I've always loved as from when I've coached is it's like a two fullback model. Is you've got
Yeah.
essentially two swinging fullbacks that can kind of play, and that could be an Apalele Fassi and a Damien Willemse type situation. That could be the way that kind of develops in the future, but it is going to be so interesting. I think that is the biggest thing from a Six Nations perspective I'm looking forward to is how teams try and exploit possibly smaller wingers, or how they try and just abuse the fact that they have bigger wingers.
Yeah, and that has an impact to the lekker back defense as well, doesn't it? The swivel hips and things. I think the person who I wonder if the person who made that law tweak realized the extent of what they were going to do. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time together discussing Angus. There's so many things that we can talk about, and I will be peppering you with questions for as long as I'm lucky enough to know you. So, thank you for that. If where can people find you?
Oh, just Twitter really. On Twitter, I can be found, yeah, and then YouTube exactly. If you want to see some YouTube videos on there. I don't have much, but I am going to try and put out some more when I have the time. And then if you are if you aren't part of the kind of modern generation and still can read, you can go to Substack and read a bit about rugby analysis, stats, players, anything I might find interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I highly recommend everybody check it out. So thank you, Gus. Thank you, everybody, for watching/listening. I hope you enjoy your rugby, and I hope everybody's team wins.